Hi, everybody. I'm Allison Cuddy from the Chicago Humanities Festival. I'm so happy to be here with you for tonight's program with Eric Klinenberg and Lolly Bowean. Earlier today, I tweeted the link to this program and I said that I was really excited about this conversation between two festival favorites, and Lolly and Eric are definitely that. They've both been on our stages many times, part of really interesting conversations. But beyond that, they're also just great friends and supporters of the festival. And as much as we care about them, they care about us too. And so I really appreciate them being here tonight. And it's hard to imagine two better people to have this conversation about the impact of the pandemic on our city than Lolly and Eric. Lolly, until recently, was a reporter, a general assignment with a reporter with the Chicago Tribune. She covered our city's neighborhoods. She covered urban affairs, youth culture, government. She's just made the move to the Field Foundation, where she is the media and storytelling program officer. And I think storytelling is going to be a critical tool for us as we make our way through this pandemic and to the other side of it. Eric Klinenberg, meanwhile, it's hard to imagine anyone better equipped to talk about what's happening right now. If you look at his body of work, he's a sociologist based at New York University. He's written about the 1995 heat wave in Chicago and its impact on our city, and in particular, how it affected some residents worse than others or harder than others. So really thinking about our social relations and social infrastructure. He's written about the trend of living alone, which is obviously a critical point as we think about experiencing social isolation. And he was last at the festival talking about the significance of public space, which is also something we're thinking a lot about in this moment when most of us are working from home or sheltering in place. So I hope you will enjoy the program tonight. I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation. This is what we do at the festival. If you're new to us, we try to create a space for these kinds of conversations. We think they're a great cultural experience and an important civic experience. So consider supporting us in whatever way makes sense to you. You can go to our website, chicagohumanities.org, to make a donation, to become or renew your membership, and to check out our forthcoming programming. Definitely come back for other programs. We'll be talking about the impact of the pandemic on the Chicago neighborhood of Englewood next Thursday, also at 7 p.m. I also encourage you to participate tonight by asking a question. We'll be taking questions, so use the chat channel and YouTube to post a question, and Lolly will get to as many of those as she can. Before I go, I want to encourage you to thank our captioner. No matter what space we're doing events in, we're committed to accessibility, and we really appreciate a captioner being here with us for this program. Finally, thanks to all of you for being here tonight. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and now please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Lolly Bowean and Eric Klinenberg.
Hi.
Lolly, I don't know about you, I'm just basking in the applause here. It was such a warm greeting we got.
Indeed, I was just waiting for all the applause to die down before I said hello to you. So hello, Eric, and welcome to virtual Chicago. How are you?
I'm good. I had to get myself kind of in the mood before the conversation tonight. So my son and I have been watching all the Last Dance episodes serially. Don't tell me who wins in the 6th season though. So no surprises for me.
Yeah, there should be no surprise that Chicago always wins. Sorry, Eric. And to my fellow New Yorkers.
Exactly. I'm happy to be back. I wish we could be in the city right now, but we'll get there.
Indeed, indeed. So tell me, how is your quarantining going? How is your time in family solitude? How are you handling it?
First of all, that's the best question. How's your quarantine going? I mean, I don't think any of us imagined that we'd have conversations like this just a few months ago. We're doing okay. New York is not a comfortable place to be right now. I mean, it's the epicenter of this crisis, and there's a lot of very sick people kind of in our network. And one of the strange experiences that we had as a family is that in the early days, the cases were just getting closer and closer and closer into our worlds, until people we knew, the parents of people we knew, people started to get very sick, and you could feel that squeeze. And so there's an intensity about the situation in New York and in this region that I think we don't really have in most other places in the United States, thankfully. And I think things are a lot better right now, generally. Like New York City has gotten the curve going down. People here have been very conscientious about staying at home, looking out for each other. And so things are looking a lot better in New York. I'd say personally, probably like everybody else, there are these kind of surprisingly wonderful moments of being home with my family. I have 2 children. My wife is here with me. We have a puppy. And so like we're getting this time together that no one ever expected to have. But they're also, like everyone else, we have a lot of dark and kind of scary moments where we just kind of register what's going on and feel sad, and we miss our friends, and we miss our parents and our family in Chicago and California. And it's hard to be away from what we always considered our real life. So it's not an easy time.
No, indeed. But it's a time when we've been called upon by our city leaders, not just in New York, but here in Chicago and across this country, to distance ourselves from each other. And the term social distancing has now become just a part of our everyday vocabulary. So I'm curious to get you talking about what you think about that term and whether you think that's a safe term itself, or if there's some concern about just that phrase, social distancing.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, actually, because early in the pandemic, the World Health Organization and then some other health groups started to use this concept to say to us, the way you survive a pandemic with a very infectious virus is you need to socially distance yourself from other people. And I understood where that was coming from, but immediately when I heard that, I thought this is a really dangerous idea, because the thing is that socially distancing involves, getting ourselves into our homes, kind of turning our backs on everybody else around us and taking care of ourselves first. And I get that impulse, and it makes sense that we want to distance ourselves. But the thing is, we want to physically distance ourselves, right? What you need to do to survive a contagious pandemic is get physical distance, because it's physical proximity that gives you a chance to catch the virus or to spread the virus to other people. Social distance has nothing to do with that, actually. So, my sense is that this is a moment when there are enormous numbers of people who have real needs and real vulnerabilities. There are, older people and people who are very sick who probably shouldn't go outside very much, who need someone to deliver food to their door or to bring medical supplies to them or to call and check in on them and make sure they're doing okay. There's more people who are living alone and aging alone than ever before. That's true in Chicago, but that's true all over the world. And those people need a call, they need contact, what they need is social solidarity, actually. I think that's a much better term for what we need, which is to say we need to recognize how interdependent we are, how our fate is linked to the fate of our neighbors, and to lend each other a hand. So what I've been saying as much as possible is, forget social distancing. The formula is this: physical distancing, social solidarity. And I think a lot of the message we need to stay healthy and safe and to get through this is right there.
So if we're physically distant from each other and we're staying 6 feet apart, and now we're covering our faces in public, so we don't even get to see whether the person is smiling or whether the person is grimacing or what's happening by reading their face. If we're physically distant from each other, how do we create those social connections, that social solidarity that you are referring to?
Well, first of all, it's hard because, we have a bunch of customs that are part of our culture that are pretty physical, we throw high fives, we pump fists, we hug each other. We're like a physically intimate people, and Chicago's a place where people, love to be close. New York is like that too. And so it's hard to be out in public and to have that mask on and to want to smile, but to not be able to do it. So I think we have to look for other things, like, for instance, there are a lot of places in the world where you can signal some affection, like this, and, like just move your hands this way, or, touch your heart, signal, find some other part of your body that can signal affection. And you know what, when you're out in the streets in Chicago, nobody wants a hug right now. Nobody wants a high five. If you do this, they're going to feel a lot better about it, and they're going to get what you're saying. But the other thing, and Lolly, I'm curious about whether this is happening with you. Like, how do you show solidarity? How do you show affection and connection? I'm not just saying this because I know she's watching from Chicago, but I'm calling my mother every day. I'm calling my father just about as much. I've got there's these people in my life, my friends from Chicago. I went to high school in Chicago. I grew up in Chicago. And the other week, 9 friends of mine who grew up in Chicago and I got on Zoom, and we spent 2 hours talking to each other, which we haven't done really since graduation. And so I think this is kind of one of the blessings of this horrible moment, which I'm not trying to be glib or to understate how hard this moment is for anyone, because it's been brutal. But a lot of us, I think, are kind of rebuilding some ties that we lost and doing what we can to establish connections to people we want to be close to. And we're even reaching out to people who live in our buildings and say, putting notes under doors and saying, hey, if you need anything, I'm here, or posting a sign in the lobby asking if people need help, or volunteering to deliver food, or to give money to an organization, to teach older people technology. There's so many ways that we can express that solidarity now. And it seems to me like this is a time for doing it. So I'm just curious, are you finding yourself reaching out to people in your life in that same way? Is that happening everywhere?
Yes, I think absolutely. Especially the first couple weeks. I think I burned through all of my cell phone minutes the first 2 weeks, because that's all we did was call each other, talk on the phone, FaceTime. Then we got into Zoom hangouts. So I think you're right. A lot of that is happening. And it's happening from my age group in sort of my social circle, in part because we are so connected to technology. We can FaceTime with just the press of a button. But Eric, what do you do when you're dealing with vulnerable residents who may not have access to technology or may not understand how to use technology? How do I connect with my elderly neighbors, for example?
Yeah, so it's a real challenge. And I guess I want to say a few things here. I mean, first of all, there are definitely a lot of people who are doing this in a very old-fashioned way. So I know of neighbors in New York who are literally writing on pieces of paper, I live down the hall in apartment 4B. Here's my phone number. If you need anything, please call and I can help, and sliding it under people's doors, because they know that they've got people in their network, people who live close to them who don't have, youth, and who might not have health, and who could use a hand. And it's so great to see that kind of thing. I also know stories of, younger people that, there's all these kids who are at home all the time right now who have tech skills, a lot of college students, a lot of high school students, middle school students, young adults. And there are lots of people who are volunteering to teach, their grandparents or neighbors technology skills. And, you can't do that by barging into their home, right? It's different from the heat wave, where you really wanted people going door to door and knocking and coming inside to provide some support. But people are reaching out and telling a grandparent, here's how you use your FaceTime. Here's how you use Skype. This is what Facebook Live is like. And it's kind of cool to do that. And I guess I should say on the thing about older people here, one of the things about these kind of extreme events and crises is they really allow us to see who we are in a more clear way than we can all the time. And this is something I wrote about in my heatwave book. It's not like the heatwave was a social aberration. It just allowed us to see inequalities in Chicago and living conditions in Chicago that are always there, but that frankly, most people in Chicago don't want to absorb and reckon with. And in the same way here, we're able to see who we are in this moment. And so now a lot of people are worried that older people don't have the tech skills they need, and that older people don't have internet access or the, right technology or skills. And I just want to say that it's not an act of God that older people don't have those things. Like the fact that a lot of older people are still behind in the digital divide, that's our failure. It's a failure of social policy, right? It's a failure in the way that we've rolled out technology. It's a fail to integrate people into the new kind of public space that we all inhabit. And in some ways, it's kind of on us to deal with that. And I think one of the things we're able to see is just how essential it is for everyone to be able to be connected and have those skills. So why is the internet not a utility? Why does every American not have access to the internet at home that's either free or affordable? That's a big question for us all to face. And why do so many people lack the skills that they need to engage in a world where public culture, civic culture, the census, maybe even voting is going to happen online? Those are questions that we're going to have to reckon with when this is over.
Yeah, no, definitely. It opens up a big question, not just about access, but also about attitude, right? I know for me, when I got my laptop, I covered up the video camera because I thought I'm not a video camera type of girl,
And
right?
because you're worried someone's watching you. Yeah.
Right, exactly. I really rarely used FaceTime, and now I'm on video all the time. And so I had to switch my attitude, and I'm sure a lot of people have had to switch their attitudes. I want to talk about the 1995 heat wave, but before I jump into that, I'm curious as to whether you've been thinking about how this moment impacts young children and what this means for them and their social connections in their interaction and sort of relationship with technology.
Yeah, I mean, this is not an academic matter for me because I'm living with two youngish children, 11 years old and 13 years old. And it's hard. I mean, I'll tell you, like, for children who are accustomed to being engaged in the world and spending time with their friends, going to school, leaving home at 8 o'clock in the morning, coming home at 4 o'clock or 6 o'clock, playing sports, doing all kinds of social stuff, face to face, music, playgrounds, being in the tactile analog world, to now be home and alone with your parents of all people. I mean, what torture. And I think it's very stressful. I think it's confusing. There's a way in which I think children can understand what's going on, but there's a lot that's hard to understand. And different kids are responding to this in different situations. Let's be clear also, there's just profound inequalities that are shaping this experience for everyone, and so we know that for a lot of African Americans and Latinos working in places like Chicago and New York, they remain on the lines as essential workers and are much more likely to get the virus, to get very sick from the virus, to die from the virus. But the children of those people are also more likely to suffer the losses of people in their family, to deal with health problems in their family, and to struggle with being in smaller apartments, tighter residential areas where you can't easily walk out to the big backyard, where you don't have the suburban space. They're less likely to have the technology that you need to do remote education. And this is a big issue, like, you can't do remote education if you don't have internet access at home, if you don't have the right technology, if there's too many people in the house and it's difficult to get peace and space. And so I think that there are just major challenges for children and the people who take care of them, that they're like second, third order right now because we're so focused on how to keep vulnerable people alive. But I think this is going to be an experience that we are dealing with for many years to come.
Yes. And one of the things that you mentioned is about the vulnerability of workers, and particularly African American and Latino workers who are on the front line working at grocery stores or delivering packages and are still being exposed. This kind of feeds into some of your research on solidarity, right? Solidarity isn't just picking up the phone and calling people, but it also is creating a social safety net so that people are safe in that way too. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's such a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. And I should say, if we're going to name groups that are especially vulnerable, I mean, my understanding is that women are overwhelmingly more likely to be in these jobs that we consider to be essential work. And so, I think women are on the line also.
And let's acknowledge the differently able too, right? Those who are homebound because they are physically unable to go out in the public and be able to shop for themselves or get resources for themselves.
There's a lot of very specific kinds of vulnerability, and they all deserve our attention and concern. And of course, the only way to have really smart policy is to think about where those areas are, identify people and places that have real vulnerability needs, and then to throw resources there to better protect them. And of course, that's the last thing that we're doing at the federal level. But maybe let's not go down that avenue right now, because you'll get me worked up and angry, and you don't want to see that this early in the night, because this is, we're talking about solidarity, and I want to tell you about scaling up solidarity. We talked about the face-to-face and person-to-person thing. And I want to tell you about the politics of solidarity when it comes to do things like worker protection and healthcare coverage. But we have at the federal level the opposite of solidarity right now. And I'm a social scientist, not by trade a moralist or a preacher. But I just want to express my total outrage as an American citizen by the failure of leadership that we have right now, because it's an utter horror. What we're seeing from the federal government. We've dropped the ball. We are getting crushed by this virus and not doing what almost every other nation on earth has been able to do, which is to establish a basic set of public health guidelines that are science driven, and to produce solidarity from citizens who want to stay alive, and to value human life. And I just think it's an abomination that so many Americans are getting killed by our public policy. And so, sorry for that. I apologize.
I think that's a part of the conversation that we should be having when you take a step back and kind of really look at the policies that continue to drive this, right? The fact that people go to work sick because they don't have access to leave policies that are liberal, or that people were working through this pandemic and working overtime because they don't earn a living wage. So I think this is part of the conversation that we should be having, not just calling your neighbors to make sure that they are safe on a personal level, but also calling on our congressmen, calling on our elected officials, calling on public officials to make sure that this crisis translates into a bigger social safety net. So I don't think you need to apologize for
good. So I'm gonna double down on them, and I'll say, let's look at some of the policies that I think are really making us vulnerable. So first of all, if you don't have universal access to healthcare, and people have differential access to really good treatment, then what happens is these things. We have this whole phrase about underlying conditions. One of the vulnerabilities is having an underlying condition. That's a very vague idea, underlying conditions. Let's think about what that means. Enormous numbers of Americans have underlying conditions of some way, in some way. If you have a job that gives you access to good healthcare coverage, then if you have an underlying condition, you get treated, you get it under control. And when the pandemic comes around, although you have that condition, you're probably in decent shape. You can probably manage it. If you don't have good access to healthcare coverage, then the underlying condition is not controlled. You're probably more sick than the virus hits, which makes you more vulnerable, right? So one reason that so many people are dying in the United States is that we have so many vulnerable people who are not getting the kind of healthcare coverage that people take for granted in the rest of the developed world, right? And let's be very frank about that. Another thing is, and you mentioned this, we don't have paid sick leave in a way that almost every other country that we compete with does. And so there have been many studies that show that American workers, even if they're in the food industry and their job is working in a restaurant and serving food, they know that if they're sick and they miss work, they won't get paid, and there's a decent chance that they'll lose their job if they're sick enough to miss a few days. And so what do Americans do in that context? They go to work even when they're sick. And if you wind up eating food from someone in the food industry who's carrying a virus, that's bad news for you. It's bad news for their fellow employees. Here's another way. If we don't make a real investment in education, in public education, in our elementary schools, our middle schools, and our high schools, in our state universities, which have gotten more and more expensive, then what happens is Americans, our neighbors, don't get the kind of education they need. And when there's a new virus that comes out, a lot of people can't really tell the difference between the flu and a lethal virus. And so when they see on the television that the guys on Fox News and the president are saying it's just like the flu and we've got this under control, we failed to give them an education that allows them to see through that, right? And so all of these policy failures that for me are about our lack of solidarity. They stem from a lack of solidarity, and then they produce a lack of solidarity. They have come to bite us in this case. And they've made this crisis in the United States so much more dangerous, so much more deadly, and I fear so much more durable than in other places, right? Because we are not turning the curve on this thing. That's what's so horrible about this moment. The country is reopening. People are going back to their jobs. They're going back into public life. And we haven't even started to get the curve going down. It's outrageous.
Yes. And I think that that's why the conversation needs to be broadened, right? And that we do need to touch on what you're saying, because part of the reason why people are eager to go back to work is because they have to pay bills. And part of those bills are for housing, for food. And we should be, if we're the wealthiest country in the world, right? If we're as wealthy as we say that we are, then we should be able to provide for the needs of people so that their health and their livelihoods are not compromised, right? So I think that this conversation has to be broadened from just, again, just calling your neighbors to also calling on your elected officials. So we're game on that. We see each other on that.
Well, here we are. Yeah, we've taken it there. and you know, I mean, this matters for the politics of the bailout, right? Because here's this other crazy thing: we are spending trillions of dollars already on the biggest financial bailout in American history, and we will spend trillions more. There's now 33 million Americans who are unemployed. In many states, the unemployment rate is already more than 25%. And who is making decisions about where that money should go? You know, we in the bailout package, we wound up generating $90 billion of tax reductions for American millionaires. American millionaires just got bailed out to the tune of $90 billion because that's what the Trump administration demanded as a condition, and the Senate as a condition for passing a fiscal bailout. Meanwhile, 1 in 5 American children is going to bed hungry tonight. Absolutely. 1 in 5 children is going to bed hungry tonight. Mm-hmm. In many European nations and in Canada, the deal is, you know, you're going to get some monthly salary that's close to what you got in your job until your job goes back. The bailout goes directly to people in a consistent way, month after month. Here in the United States, some Americans got a $1,200 check, right? And that's the end of it. And a lot of big companies got bailed out. The airline industry just got $25 billion. They couldn't fire people for X weeks. When X weeks came up, thousands of people just got laid off. Right. So it really matters how we bail out the economy and how we invest in each other. And look, let's face it, the analogous historical event to the one we're going through now was the Great Depression. And the end of the Great Depression came because we created the New Deal. And the New Deal was not perfect policy. There are all sorts of ways in which it discriminated by race, by ethnicity, by sex. There's a lot of problems with the New Deal, but there's also one of the most extraordinary and progressive set of political programs we've ever had in this country. It sparked an incredible period of economic growth. It created the middle class and helped us reinvest in each other. We built parks, we built playgrounds, we built infrastructure, we built extraordinary buildings. We invested in culture and the arts. We put America and Americans back to work with a redistributed program. And what we need right now is another New Deal. We probably need a Green New Deal, but I fear that what we're getting instead is a giveaway to people who really don't need that money. And it's very cynical, but everything is on the line right now. And then the last point I'll make, ordinarily when there's a situation like this and Americans are very upset about public politics, we march on the mall in Washington, D.C. We go to the Daily Plaza and we hold up signs and we assemble together. We go to Springfield. We go to Zuccotti Park in New York to Occupy Wall Street when we're really outraged by something that seems unjust. And one of the very hard things about this moment is we don't have access to any of those places. Instead of the mall in Washington, we have Zoom and YouTube. We have Twitter. And I think those are pretty weak substitutes.
Mhm. Well, we still have letter writing, right? And I just want to acknowledge that the world that we're talking about, where you can have access to medical care, where you can have universal education, where you can have that social safety net, is not one that we've imagined. There are countries that provide that for their citizens and their residents. And I think when you talk about the New Deal, it points back to a time when we were considered having progressive policy, and our government was making sure that that safety net was there.
That's
Mhm.
right. That's right.
I want to rewind to the 1995 heat wave that you wrote about and that you researched that took place here in Chicago, where hundreds of lives were lost as a result of social isolation and people not having access to resources. After that happened, there became this messaging that was pretty much universal here in Chicago, that you should call and check in on your neighbors. And that has become a part of the sort of routine, the ritual of when we have extreme weather events. Why, in this case, there hasn't been that same type of advocacy? How come there hasn't been that same type of push that we have some solidarity with each other versus having all of the distance? Can you talk about that?
Well, actually, I didn't know that. So do you feel that's going on in Chicago, that the message from Chicago is, socially distance yourself from your neighbors and not, check in on each other?
I feel that the message is so strong about staying in the house
Mm.
and socially distancing from each other, that there's been less emphasis on actually checking in on each other and coming together in this moment. So I'm not saying that it's completely absent, but it's definitely not emphasized in the way that it has been for tragic weather events, for example.
That makes sense to me. I think it goes back to that first conversation we had about the social distance concept. The language is very powerful. The framing we use for these political events and medical events, it really shapes us, right? So a few weeks ago, no one had heard of a coronavirus. No one had thought about quarantine or socially distancing. I remember when people started talking about quarantining in New York City, and the idea made no sense to me. Like, how do you quarantine in New York City? I'm sure it felt the same in Chicago. And then very early, we got this concept of social distancing, which told us all, get home, close your door, order as much food as you possibly can, stock up and check in when this is all over, And that is not the message you get in the heat wave, which is, knock on your neighbor's door, call your family members, make sure everybody's okay. But the truth is, we need that knock on the door right now. And the thing is that, sometimes a knock on the door is a knock that says, there's food here. Don't open the door. You can't see me right now. Let's stay physically distant, but I just want you to know that I'm here. Sometimes the knock on the door is a phone call. Sometimes the knock on the door is an email, or a meeting on Zoom. But the knock on the door is something that we know we need. And Chicago learned that lesson the hard way in 1995, right? The story of the heat wave. The problem in the heat wave was not that people didn't have a way to cool down. All you need to cool down is some water, right? You just need to get yourself into some water. The problem is people don't know that they're getting very sick because their bodies fail them. And what keeps you alive is the knock on the door, right? What keeps you alive is social support. And the scary thing about the heat wave, and the reason it really matters for Chicago, is the social support was so hard to get. The knocks on the door did not come. And I think it's a real gut check for the city of Chicago, which prides itself as being a city of neighborhoods, to confront that reality. And now we're in the situation where there are a lot of people, a lot of places in Chicago that are really at risk. And we know who they are, we know where they are. I mean, the thing that happened in Cook County Jail was a travesty.
Yes.
Just another travesty.
Mhm.
Because it's people we think of, we treat as if they're expendable, as if their lives don't matter. And then we find out that we really do damage to them. And so again, this is a moment for us to see more clearly and to wake up and to recognize our shared humanity.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to do that when you feel afraid of other people. And it's hard to do that when we're all wearing masks, but we have to dig down deep and look for that in ourselves.
Yeah, I think one of the lessons from this moment too is, as you said, that we too often treat certain people as if they're expendable. But now that we're in crisis, we're learning what essential worker actually means, right? That some of the lowest paid and hardest working people are who we're dependent upon in order for us to get our groceries, in order for us to have transportation, in order for us to go to a restaurant and get a meal served to us. And so some of the people who have been overlooked for so long, are now having to reckon with the fact that these are the people who keep our society moving.
I'm so happy you said that, and I so hope we do. I mean, I hope we sustain that recognition and respect, and find a way to remunerate and compensate the essential workers who have put themselves on the line, right? Like, no one considered the janitor or the cashier or the delivery person or the bus driver an essential worker who needed some kind, who played this special role in society before. Let's think about the farm workers, for instance. I mean, what an incredible story that is. Before this happened, the Trump administration was hunting down farm workers with ICE patrols, putting people in detention camps, which were really like concentration camps, separating families, deporting people. This event happens, and the next thing we know, they're called essential workers, and ICE says they're not going to do the raids. I thought that was an extraordinary moment. Of course, a few days later, the Trump administration then said they wanted to reduce the pay to farm workers because that would be helpful to the agricultural industry. So it's not like that, recognition that they're essential workers came with all the protections. But let's make sure when we get to the post-pandemic moment that we fight to remember who put their lives on the line in this moment. And I guess let me just say one thing about this: that we're in this horrible moment where I think a lot of us are watching our neighbors in different parts of the country, or maybe even I know in Illinois, there was a protest the other day of people who wanted to reopen Illinois. I saw some pretty horrible signs and messages. There's a lot of ideological division in our country and a lot of hate, and that's hard to live with. But there's a lot of people who really want to get back open, and I want us to say here that there's a part of me that just is horrified by this. It feels like the leadership is part of some death cult and just says like human life doesn't have any value. And I shudder at that leadership. But then I have to check myself because, I have this job. I'm a professor at NYU. I've been teaching my classes online. I've been able to do my work remotely. My wife's been able to do her work remotely. My family, most people are professionals, and life has kind of gone on, and while there's a lot of insecurity, I don't even know if what's going to happen to higher education after this. Here I am, I'm still eating, and the one thing I want to say about that impulse to be horrified and judgmental about people who want to open it up is that there are tens of millions of Americans right now who really are terrified that they've lost their job, that their job's not coming back, that the government's not going to provide for them after this. That if they don't find some way to get things going again and start making some money, the consequences for them are going to be really severe. And there's a lot of young people who feel like, they're probably not going to be horribly sick from this. And so, how much are they being asked to shoulder? And that too is the consequence of living in a society that doesn't provide basic social protections, because if you fall in the United States, if things fall apart for you in the United States, unlike in Germany or in Canada or in Sweden, if you fall hard, and you fall far. And so there are a lot of people who are legitimately scared about what's going to happen to them. And I just ask that everybody who feels as horrified as I do when you see people rushing out and saying, please let us go back to work. Some just want to go to the party on the beach, screw them. But a lot of people are just trying to find a way to get back and make a living. And there's a pain and anxiety here that I think we need to reckon with.
Yeah, that pain and that anxiety is real, but it does kind of go back to your theory about not having that social net or that solidarity to know that we'll be okay. Because we operate as individuals, we're not operating as a unit. And so when you're right, when you fall very hard because you don't have the embrace of our community and our society to pick you back up and make sure that you're not at the bottom.
Right.
Yeah, I'm curious, because of your studies on people living alone, do you think that that made us better prepared to quarantine? Or do you think that damaged our ability to quarantine because we live alone, we have our solitude, but then we like to go out in the public. So how does that all this alone time impact our ability to quarantine now?
It's a great question. I don't really know the answer, but I guess I would say that I'm kind of negative about it, because when I wrote this book about the fact that people were living alone, the message of it was that people who are living alone for the most part are not socially isolated. Some are isolated, some do feel very lonely, but the surprising finding from going solo for me is that so many people who lived alone, including older people, were actually incredibly social, more social than married people. They spend a lot of time in, the library. They spend time in senior centers. They go to parks. They go to diners and restaurants. They visit with their neighbors. People who live alone are heavy users of public life and public spaces, and so that's how they make a social life. And what happened with this pandemic is suddenly everybody who lives alone became isolated, like that. And that was not something that they had signed up for. And being isolated is really different from living alone. And isolation can be very stressful. It can be damaging for your health, to be stressed in that way. It leads a lot of people to get depressed and to get lonely. And I think this is a very hard moment, not just for our physical health, but also for our mental health. A lot of people are really struggling. And I think one of the things that makes me nervous about our failure to contain the pandemic here in this country is that, it's kind of one thing to have it happen the first wave, for this first time. It's spring, it's getting to summer, the days are a little brighter. But if we wind up in a big second wave in, November, December, I remember what it was like in November and December in Chicago. The days are short, the days are dark, it's very cold. I think it's going to be very hard on people if we have to go through this once again in a few months after coming out a little bit. So I think that the stakes around mental health are very high. And, even if you're physically getting through this and you haven't caught the virus, you might be suffering in some profound ways.
Yeah. One of our viewers, Daniela, asks how do you stay positive? Because you're talking about mental health. So how do you cultivate positivity without seeming ignorant of the reality of the harshness that we're facing? How do you remain sort of upbeat in this time?
Are you asking if I'm upbeat? Is that I don't know. I don't feel like I've been especially upbeat in this conversation. I'm ready to go out and start howling, when we finish. But I don't know. Like, I think there's a lot of reasons to feel very angry, and that as you could tell, I think it's healthy to express that anger, and necessary at some moments. I think we need to be kind of analytically sharp, and we need to be thinking really carefully about what is really happening. And I guess when I can muster some sense of positivity, it's from thinking about the possibility of this moment, because I've never experienced another moment in my life where I have felt, as I do now, that everything is up for grabs. And I really do feel that way. I mean, it feels to me right now like everything is up for grabs, and that is terrifying, and it's also exhilarating. Because I could see a scenario where if you said to me, Eric, you know what, I have a crystal ball here, and I can tell you that in November there's going to be no election. They're gonna find a way to cancel the election, and they're gonna appoint themselves in power for as long as they possibly can, and they're gonna suppress democracy, and it's gonna be a horror show. If you told me that right now, I find that totally plausible. But also, if you told me, what's gonna happen, Eric, is that people in the United States are gonna say this is outrageous and we're done with this, and we want to build solidarity, and we want a new deal, and we want a Green New Deal, because we better build something that's sustainable. And as soon as COVID ends, climate change awaits us. And let's invest in each other. Let's build amazing new infrastructure. Let's think about how to live better. Let's take the lessons of this seriously. let's throw these bums out. If you told me that was going to happen, I believe that even more. I mean, I actually think we're totally capable of that. And so the optimism I get from this moment is that it's going to be, we have a lot of pain ahead of us. We've been immersed in a lot of pain already. It's not going to be easy, but there is a path out of here that takes us to a place that we need to go. And let's be honest with each other. It wasn't like things were that great in January.
Mm-hmm.
We've been in a dark place for a long time.
Mm-hmm. That was just the place that we knew, so it seemed so normal. But I agree with you that we can remain optimistic that this can force us to imagine a better future and a better pathway, one with access to health care, one where people can earn a living wage, one where we actually recognize who is essential and how essential they are to society, right? You're getting us all fired up here, Eric.
Let's try to do that. I mean, we can't we can't go like assemble somewhere and rally now, but we could use those icons that we have on the machines now, where you can like put a hand up, right?
Yeah. So do you think that this pandemic could lead to some policy shifts? Do you think that it could actually translate into some government change? And that's just to note, that is a question from someone who's watching, Allison. So we say hey to Allison and thank her for her question.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we're entering into the period where we will have more profound political and social change than any time in our lives. I really do. I mean, I think major changes are coming. I just don't know which direction they're going to go in. And I'll be honest about that. I mean, there's like a nightmare scenario that every thinking American should have right now, where there is a full-on assault on democracy and our governing institutions, and we're watching it. It's not like it's being hidden. I mean, today the Justice Department pardoned Michael Flynn. I mean, we just found out that the CDC issued a set of guidelines for how to get American industries back, for how to open childcare, how to open schools, how to open churches, how to get restaurants going again. And the president said, no, it's too negative. I don't want that. So, I mean, there's an attack on science. There's an attack on democracy. We're watching it. We're experiencing it. So that could continue. But as I said before, I think there are a lot of Americans who are fed up with this. I've seen a lot of polls saying, you know what, Americans don't want to go reopen the economy. Americans they like their lives very much. They would prefer to be alive. They do not want to sacrifice the grandparents. I don't see a lot of older Americans lining up to die so that the wealthiest people in the country can get a bigger tax break. I mean, I think it's grotesque. And so I genuinely can see us coming out of here in a place that it feels more progressive and feels more hopeful, that gives us a chance to have the kind of reset that we need, because we face serious obstacles, major inequalities. There's great frustration that's been brewing for a long time. And as it happens, I don't know if you know this, but this is actually an election year. Do you know that we're having elections here?
Oh yeah, I can't miss it. But I'm a journalist, so or I spent most of my adult life as a journalist, so I can't tune out of an election.
So we have a chance to do something about that, right? I mean, we have a historic chance, and so everything is up for grabs. Everything is on the line. It's like I can't think of a more important political moment in my life. And as much as I can see the dark possibilities, I genuinely can see us doing something extraordinary. And looking back on this moment and thinking with sadness about all the people we lost and all of the suffering we did. But I could also see us thinking the way we think about the 1930s right now, which is that there was a lot of pain and there was also an amazing renewal. And what followed was something extraordinary.
Yeah, no, and since we're in this political moment, since this is the year of an election, a major presidential election, we can force a conversation about things that have not been talked about a universal wage, about seriously attacking poverty in this country, about seriously having a conversation in policy centered around equity and access, right? So in some ways that's empowering. We can be empowered from this moment. But Eric, Where do we start as individuals here in Chicago? How do we begin the path toward this solidarity? Just as individuals, what do you suggest?
Well, I guess the reason that, I started by, asking you to think about, your neighborhood, about your family, maybe even you start at your home, is because I do think that you build solidarity at the foundations and you build up from there. So let's say this, there's a crazy social experiment happening. For the first time in human history, everybody is home all the time. We're all at home. And one way to produce some solidarity is if you're at home and you're with other people, look around and see who's doing the work at home. Like who's making the meals, who's cleaning the house, who's taking care of the kids. I'm guessing there might be some inequality at home for some people. This is probably going to come as a surprise to you, but in most American families, women are doing most of that work. I know that seems crazy to you, but trust me, there's pretty good evidence. And there was a news story that came out about this today, something like, I can't remember exactly what it was, but some huge percentage of men, about half of American men, believe that they are doing about half of the domestic work right now. And 3% of American women believe that that's the case of the men they're living with. So there's probably some inequality at home that could be rectified. And so we could start to build solidarity just in the places we live by like checking in with each other and saying, hey, I now can see all this stuff that's happening, because even when we're all here, we're reproducing this. And then you can scale it up. You can think about how can you take care of your neighbor? Why is it, if you're in Chicago, you know what, it's the same map of vulnerability in Chicago that we have for every other problem, whether it's heart disease or diabetes or air pollution or heat wave deaths or COVID-19 deaths, right? I mean, it's the same neighborhoods time after time that are, that prove to have the most death and the most suffering, the most disease. And it's the other neighborhoods that generally escape them. And we know everybody who's watching right now, I presume at this point it's mainly my family, but everybody who's watching right now, knows what that map looks like. And so Solidarity Chicago is saying, let's make sure that when we respond to cases like this, we target resources to the people and places that really need them. And let's make sure that when this is over, we rectify that situation.
Yeah, so we know where to go. We know where to look. We know who's vulnerable, in part because of the segregation of Chicago, right? And not just race segregation, but also income segregation. So we know who is going to suffer and who's going to struggle and where to go. But I like that idea of attacking the inequality at home first and then letting it resonate outward. One of our viewers, Joshua Hauser, wants to know what you think about the role of religious institutions in this moment and in the revisioning of our country, of our society.
I mean, religious institutions are ubiquitous in American society. There's more churches in American society than there are McDonald's, Burger King's, Pizza Hut, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Starbucks, combined. There's churches everywhere. And, there are synagogues and mosques. We are more religious than a lot of other countries that are like us. And so if you think about institutions that have a role to play in, building solidarity and encouraging us to look after one another, whether you're a religious person or not, it's a social fact that a lot of your neighbors are. And so look, it's a hard time because there are a lot of people who like to go to church every Sunday or to synagogue on Saturday, and they can't do that right now. And so they're, going to synagogue the way that we're having a conversation on Zoom, and that's not adequate as a substitute, but it's what we got. And so I guess, I think religious organizations can really promote a kind of solidarity and a decency. But FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, talked about basic Christian ethics informing the New Deal, making sure that you acted as your brother's keeper. That was the charge of the New Deal, making sure that we felt that we were in this together. Unfortunately, religion in America, like so many other things in America, is segregated. It can be ideological and divisive. There's some religious communities who feel that their moral obligation begins and ends with people who are in their community, and that's it. And there are other religious communities that take seriously their obligation to repair the world and to do social justice beyond their own group lines. And so I think, especially if you're part of a religious community that has that more outward orientation, that can take care of itself, take care of each other, and then take care of your neighbors too, that could only be a good thing.
So you've written about the heat wave of 1995. And oddly enough, I was here for that. I was an intern at the Chicago Tribune. So I was a part of helping to cover that heat wave. So it's very resonant in my mind. You've written about people living alone more, the growing number of people who are choosing to live alone. What's next for you, Eric? What should we expect from you in your writing?
I've been working a lot on the problem of climate change and how cities are going to deal with climate change. And I continue to work on these issues about public space. I wrote this book called Palaces for the People about social infrastructure and public spaces and how they shape the life of cities. And that feels more relevant to me than before because I do believe that we're going to have to make some major investments in new infrastructure coming out of this just to get Americans back to work. And so it's going to matter what kinds of infrastructure we build. But also, and this won't surprise you, like a lot of people in the university world now, I'm trying to study what's happening around this coronavirus pandemic. And I've been writing grant proposals and putting teams together to do the kind of research on this crisis that I did around the heat wave in 1995. I run a thing at NYU called the Institute for Public Knowledge, and we have a lot of researchers who are eager to engage these problems. And so, we already have a big series of projects going, including research on, why has the U.S. fared as badly as it's fared during this crisis compared to other nations? Why have some American cities done so much better than others? Why are some neighborhoods so much better off or so much worse off than others? How do we understand those inequalities? And I'm also really looking at this question about solidarity. What does it mean to produce solidarity in this moment? Given the world today, what are the challenges to doing it? And do we have any chance to rebuild better? I can't think of a more urgent question.
Yes. No, can we rebuild better is the question, right? Eric, thank you so much for joining us here in Chicago. I wish you were here so that we could get a hold of your book and get signatures, but you're being embraced from afar, from more than just your cousins.
I will be back.
You will be back. Is there anything you want to add or say before we close it out?
No, just thank you for being here with me. If you're still here and you love Chicago, I really do recommend this Last Dance documentary. You probably haven't heard of it, but there was once this basketball player named Michael Jordan in Chicago, and he turned out to be pretty good. He was a good athlete, and it's hard to find the right entertainment these days. But I couldn't think of anything better for lifting your spirits, especially if like me, you happen to have grown up in Chicago in the 1980s.
All right. Well, that's a wonderful endorsement. I'm seeing a lot of talk about The Last Dance on Twitter, and it just aligned with it is the Jordan tennis shoes, which have been selling out like crazy as a result. So,
anybody has a pair that you could send to my 13-year-old son, you will have a grateful family in New York forever. Just put our name on them and put them in the mail. The original Air Jordans is what we're looking for, and we would really appreciate that.
So the ones, yeah, the Jordan ones. You can send a pair to me too. How about that?
No, I really enjoyed it.
No, this was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Take care.
And now we'll turn it over back to the Chicago Humanities Festival staff. Thank you all for joining us. This was an absolute pleasure.